On behalf of my co-presenter and myself, Peter Devlin, thank you for tuning in. I'm Dr. Charles Zeiders, and I am going to launch the first of two lectures in our continuing education workshop on malignant narcissism and power. And it's a very important topic, as you know. Currently in the world today, there are cult-like organizations springing up everywhere. Politically, commercially, and in the religious realm as well. And we are interested in maintaining, doing our part to maintain the integrity of these institutions. And in our scholarship and in our clinical work, we have become concerned with the phenomenon of malignant narcissism and power, a certain type of character pathology that afflicts leaders or would-be leaders in such a way that they rise to power and turn groups of people into totalistic groups, totalitarian groups, cult-like groups. And we believe that we've discovered the character type, the character pathology that epitomizes this particular type of leader. And that's the object of clinical concern for today. And what I want to do is start off reading to you some of the essential characteristics of the particular type of character that we think afflicts these groups. And very often there's a spillover effect from the organizations that this type of actor gets control of that injures not only individuals and the institutions they take over, but also society itself. So, please pardon some brief reading in this regard. I want to talk about the etiology of malignant narcissism and also some of the developmental elements that seem to contribute to the formation of the megalomaniacal type of actor that Peter Devlin and I will be addressing today. And first and foremost, I want to start with the developmental origin of this actor. It starts in infancy. The developmental origin of the character pathology known as malignant narcissism is the inferno-like soul of an afflicted infant. Masterson describes the abandonment depression as a composite of 6 affects, which he refers to as the 6 horsemen of the psychic apocalypse. These include homicidal rage, suicidal depression, panic, helplessness and hopelessness, guilt, emptiness, and void. Homicidal rage is a combination of anger and depression, which conspire to generate a pressurized, visceral fury. In maturity, this core pathology of malignant narcissism will determine the course of their leadership style. Understandably, their leadership will be rendered dangerous by inflamed infantile affects that will drive extremes of intellect and behavior. Under stress, the malignant leader will endure storms of emotion that will hijack their intelligence and determine policy decisions. These extremes include ridiculous grandiosity, bold illegalities, delight in cruelty, and debilitating suspiciousness. The mad leader's interpersonal style will be similarly afflicted. All of this stems from the abandonment depression caused by suboptimal nurturing, accounted for by orphaning, maternal dereliction, paternal abuse, and genetic factors, which impede the infant from introjecting the medicine of parental nurture, which civilizes the psyche. The destructive leader's early life and formative years are problematic. The father will be remote, but if present, he will verbally and physically abuse the child. Distraught and helpless, the mother will spousify her offspring, projecting idealized qualities upon him, qualities she wishes her frightening husband possessed. In cases where malignant leadership has a dynastic quality, such as North Korea, the tyrant father simply role models malignant leadership behavior, and his heirs fit to the tyrant template upon assuming power. Whatever the configuration of abuse and neglect from caregivers, the destructive leader will reach maturity with pernicious assumptions about themselves, the world, and others. These will be charged with high voltage libido and portend poorly for the people and projects the leader will touch. Importantly, the subject's defensive project will compensate against the abandonment depression and ultimately express a teleology of apotheosis, or a goal of becoming a god. To escape the hell of infantile shame, powerless, neglect, and abuse, the destructive leader aspires to power and prerogatives that can be only associated with the divine. Because this defensive drive towards divinity is implicit in the tenure of the malignant leader, I have taken the liberty of coining the term God drive to distinguish it from mere primary or secondary drive. The God drive is a will to divinity that sets destructive leaders and their followers on a hero's journey that begins with optimism and concludes in hell. The poet W.H. Auden referred to such men as psychopathic gods. Obvious examples include Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, and Jim Jones, but there's many among us who are lesser known. Failing to experience love during their infancy and early development, the mad leader adapts to a relational universe where faith in God or others is impossible. Unconsciously, he fears that genuine relational love will activate the powerless vulnerability from which he spends his life defensively fleeing. For this pathetic, pained actor, human relationships will be characterized by a demand for narcissistic supplies to strengthen their grandiosity, a grandiosity which barricades the malignant narcissistic leader's inadequacy and his self-perception. And while the mad leader may speak brilliantly on spirituality, he will envy God, ultimately usurping God's place in the lives of his followers and in the face of God himself. This is the leader's primordial Faustian bargain: to choose power over love, dominance over relationship. Importantly, the mad leader is never fully defended against his unloved core and will present a heightened risk for self and other murder. This lethality can be expressed in grandiose apocalyptic fantasies, group suicide, and mass murder. Potential targets of their necrophilic libido are enemies, friends, institutions, nations, economies, and self. Potential targets of their necrophilic libido are just about anyone. Anyone associated with the malignant leader suffers a heightened mortality risk. Organizations reflective of a malignant leader's homicidality and suicidality include the Waffen-SS, the ISIS Infantry, the Solar Temple, and Marshall Applewhite's Heaven's Gate. The historical reality of these death-mongering fanatics credentials Freud's theory of the death drive and to the scriptural admonition that idolatry of self, is an abomination that careens towards desolation. Initially, such leaders do not seem to be the secular equivalent of Antichrist. To the contrary, they rise to power because they are perceived as visionary solvers of intractable problems. Followers see such leaders as messianic and likely to provide spiritual security, immense wealth, or national salvation. But these leaders are uniquely mad. They misemploy their giftedness via deeds that fulfill the clinical definition of evil. They oversee acts that are breathtakingly horrible. Their acts are preceded by malicious intent. Their acts inflict excessive suffering, and their acts, if beheld by a healthy conscience, are morally appalling, atrocious, and beyond empathic comprehension. That's a good start. What I'd like to do is take all of that abstraction and concretize it in the well-known case of Shoko Asahara and Shinrikyo. And I'm going to read from Devlin in my book, Malignant Narcissism and Power, that case study. The blind guru Shoko Asahara, born 1955, died 2018, degenerated into a destructive madness and meticulously coordinated a nerve gas assault in the Tokyo subway. Despite his loss of temporal sight, he was blind, Asahara claimed to see the future and preached to his followers that he envisioned an apocalypse which was desirable for them to actualize through terrorism in service to providence. This is from Singer's book. Quote, on March 20th, 1995, headlines across the world announced that a deadly gas had been released into the Tokyo subway system, killing 12 citizens and seriously injuring 5,000 more. Within days, the evidence accumulated about the perpetrators pointed towards Shinrikyo, a Japanese-based international cult led by 40-year-old Shoko Asahara, with a membership of 10 to 30,000 people and a net worth of more than $1 billion. Charges against Ashihara and some of his disciples included murder, kidnapping, and manufacturing and stockpiling lethal chemicals. Later, the remains of lawyers known for fighting Aum Shinrikyo, along with the remains of the lawyer's wife and 14-month-old son, were unearthed. These individuals were missing since 1989, close quote. Shoko Ashihara was a spiritual megalomaniac who murdered his critics and wanted to rule Japan and the world. Ashihara galvanized his followers with the promise of remaking the post-apocalyptic world according to their countercultural fantasies. Such dreams are almost always fear avoidance strategies. The malignantly narcissistic guru and his followers shared a blend of adolescent rebellion, magical thinking, and self-aggrandizing fantasy that supported their dread of the maturational rigors required to reach psychological adulthood. Ashihara seduced them with the delights of the eternal child, the Neverland, a kind of utopia, an alternate reality in which followers avoid becoming their despised parents and enjoy super status in an empire of elites, a fantasized alternate world where self-esteem is guaranteed by all the rights and privileges of in-group status on a cosmic level. Born into Japanese post-war devastation in 1955, Shoko Ashihara entered the world with infantile glaucoma. He was partially blind in his right eye and utterly blind in his left. Sent to a special school with blind students, Ashihara exploited his partial sight to attain social power. But he was disliked for extorting money from his peers and lost school elections due to his reputation as a bully. Denied admittance to Tokyo University, Ashihara practiced acupuncture, purveyed fraudulent cures, and suffered the disgrace of jail time and bankruptcy. In 1984, at the age of 29, following time spent in prison, Ashihara embarked for India, where he studied Buddhist enlightenment. Then, returning to Japan, the mystic declared a new religion, petitioned for legal status, and recruited a following of financially fit young professionals with technical educations. Dismayed by the post-war culture of drudgery and workaholism, his followers were promised collective meaning and individual enlightenment if they adhered to his polyglot doctrine of Buddhism, Hinduism, and esoteric Christianity. In exchange for surrendering their wealth to Aum Shinrikyo, reading Ashihara's books, ingesting hallucinogens, wearing brainwave helmets, and practicing celibacy and fasting, the disciples were promised to survive a poison gas attack from the United States, instigated, Ashihara prophesied, by Freemasons and Jews. Such promises attracted a following. Just prior to launching their nerve gas attack, Ashihara's organization boasted up to 40,000 adherents globally and enjoyed revenue from subsidiaries like coffee shops and computer assembly factories. Discipline was enforced by Ashihara loyalists who kidnapped defectors and murdered the guru's detractors. Although Ashihara declared himself to be the Christ, his narcissism, grandiosity, and audacious criminality also expressed along temporal lines. According to Japanese authority, the guru was impatient for the doomsday scenario that would kill 90% of the world's population. Thus, deciding to hasten his prophecy, which failed to fulfill on its own, he ordered the subway gas attacks, operating under the delusion that his chemical terrorism would overthrow the government of Japan and elevate him to emperor. The master's decision to fulfill his own prophecy did not usher in a post-apocalyptic golden age. Instead, 12 people died and 5,000 others were injured from the sarin gas attack. Ashihara and his top disciples were arrested and charged with responsibility for a terrorist attack. Aum Shinrikyo, once a 40,000 person strong organization, was disgraced and withered to a fraction of its size, and Shoko Ashihara was hanged by the Japanese government in 2018. It was observed that prior to his death, the loss of narcissistic supplies from worshipful sycophants caused a mental breakdown characterized by observable psychosis in the courtroom. That's just one example out of, sadly, an endless amount to choose from of malignant narcissism in power. Now, let me familiarize you with two stories that are relevant to this topic. Now, the first is the story of Cain and Abel, and I think that this ancient tale found in the book of Genesis really demonstrates certain characteristics of the malignant narcissist. You know, Adam and Eve had two brothers, and Abel would make sacrifices, and the Lord God appreciated them. Cain, his sacrifices were not received as well, and he became envious of his brother. So in this state of envy, which is a characteristic of narcissism, Cain murdered his brother Abel. And in this story, the earth cried out when Abel's blood was spilled, and it came to the attention of God. And God tried to bring Cain to account. And he said, I think that you have killed your brother. Why? What's up? And instead of accounting, Cain protested and really remonstrated with God, and wouldn't express, you know, remorse or anything like that. And God became frustrated, and he said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you into the desert. You have to wander the earth apart from other people. You can never go into the cities. You have to go into the desert. And Cain again protested. It's not expressing remorse, not taking responsibility or anything. He said, well, if I'm walking around out there alone, people are going to kill me. And perhaps in frustration, it was really hard to hold this actor to account. God said, okay, I'll put a mark on you. This is the mark of Cain. And this mark will mean that nobody can kill you. And so the mark was put on him, and a careful reading of the ancient scripture seems to indicate that Cain really didn't abide by his sentence. He wouldn't even abide by a sentence that had been rendered upon him by God, the ultimate judge. And he went on to defy his sentence, and he founded a city. And the city had a reputation for being very, very fierce, a very, very dangerous group. It was a city that you might say is sort of like a proto mafia city. The character of Cain became part of an entire group and infected the region with its malicious behavior. All of this is cautionary. This is, a pre-modern, pre-psychology, pre-psychiatry rendering of a certain kind of character that is envious, narcissistic, and recognizes no authority but his own. Now, what to do about that? How can this be addressed? During the rise of National Socialism, the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm began to search the ancient religious documents of the Western world and felt that one answer resided in a psychoanalytic interpretation of the myth of Cain and Abel's parents, Adam and Eve. And if you remember the story of the fall, Adam and Eve defied God's authority, and they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Fromm's take on that particular story defies the theologians, but if you consider that there was the rise of Hitler and National Socialism, you can see that he said that the desirable individuation of the individual citizen, the ability to question authority and to have knowledge of good and evil and to make independent judgments of these matters is absolutely essential to guard society against this particular type of actor, the malignant narcissist who strives for power. Very interesting take on the story of the fall in the Garden of Eden. Now, in the last century, there were psychologists and psychoanalysts who weighed in on this phenomenon. Otto Kernberg characterized the malignantly narcissistic leader as a narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features, paranoid traits, egocentric aggression of the sadistic variety. Accompanying features included an underdeveloped or deformed superego, power cravings, and grandiosity. Then the psychoanalyst George Pollack wrote in 1978, the malignant narcissist presented as pathologically grandiose, lacking in conscience, and had characteristic demonstrations of joyful cruelty. There's your sadism. And M. Scott Peck explored malignant narcissism as a psychological construct that explains evil. Fromm himself called the malignantly narcissistic leader the quintessence of evil. And it was Fromm who was the first formulator of this particular construct. You should know that Devlin and I are also, in addition to being scientist practitioners, we're also scholar practitioners, and we draw on the humanities to illustrate our points. And we believe that cinema, poetry, film, history, literature, all of these are ways of knowing, of having a conversation with this phenomenon. And the reason why there's this slide of Dennis Hopper's character in Apocalypse Now, he played a crazed journalist in the jungle. And if you remember that particular story, there was a major who was sent by the United States Army into the jungles of Southeast Asia to find a rogue colonel, Colonel Kurtz, who was a malignant narcissist in power. And the reason why the military assigned this major to kill Colonel Kurtz was because Kurtz had, like any malignant narcissist in power, broke with any authority that would put constraints on his mad vision and his unacceptable and dangerous leadership. Kurtz had broken with the chain of command and felt that he was qualified to wage war without any constraint. He had some sort of trauma during earlier military service where he felt that he had an epiphany, like a kind of negative religious awakening, where he understood completely the nature of war. And armed with this ultimate knowledge of what war should be in its pure form, he felt that war that had any type of constraint upon it was inauthentic and cowardly. And so Kurtz had gone into the jungle and had assembled a band of followers, of indigenous people, and he was slaughtering his perceived enemies without any type of oversight from the US military. Marlon Brando, who plays Kurtz, does a wonderful job indicating the kind of the depth of this mad vision, this notion that he was a god of war who could mete out terror and horror upon the populations he was killing, and that he was waging war with a level of authenticity that was pure. In this particular scene with Dennis Hopper, Marlowe meets a half-crazed photojournalist. And in the dialogue, the photojournalist says to the major, words to the effect, "I don't know why you're coming to kill this guy. You shouldn't kill this guy. He's an extraordinary man." And Hopper goes on to say, his mind's not insane, but his soul's insane, or, words to that effect. And this is the humanities getting at something very, very important about Devlin and my understanding of the malignant narcissist. The malignant narcissist isn't insane in the way that we would think of it in terms of requiring hospitalization, although that's not a bad idea. The insanity has some type of inhuman element. And I think that in this dialogue, in this movie, this character is really getting to it. There is a disconnect from something roughly like natural law, what the appropriate existential or spiritual thing to do is. There's something terribly disconcerting about confronting this type of actor if one is individuated the way Fromm would have us be, to have our own knowledge of good and evil. If we're reasonably sane and operating in civil society, those of us who are rightly individuated will find an uncanny property to the malignant narcissist, something disconcerting, something getting at this idea that while they seem to make sense on one level and to be sane, there is some type of moral or spiritual insanity about this type of actor. This is what photojournalist who has knowledge of Colonel Kurtz says to the major: "Why would a nice guy like you want to kill a genius? Why? Because they told you he was crazy? The colonel is not crazy. The man is clear in his mind, but his soul is mad." Now, what are the assessment criteria for the malignant narcissistic leader? Well, the malignant narcissistic leader will reach power with pernicious assumptions about themselves, the world, and others. Their assumptions will be charged with high voltage libido and may portend poorly for the people and projects the leader will touch. Devlin and I have come up with a quasi-diagnostic criteria for this, and we have gradations. The first gradation for the destructive leader, or for the malignant narcissist in power, is a destructive leader. A person of interest who may hold himself in high regard shall qualify for the term destructive leader if, one, he holds a position, a leadership position, or aspires to one, and two, has or may inflict injury on persons or groups, violating relevant norms, or offend against human dignity. A malignant narcissist leader is a person of interest already qualified for the term destructive leader, who shall qualify for the term malignantly narcissistic leader if he evinces, according to information and belief, a narcissistic personality disorder characterized by grandiosity, the signs and symptoms of which would be recommended by diagnostic manuals, or the obvious signs from the DSM, the ICD-9, the Malignant Narcissist Interview, take your pick, and antisocial behavior delimited by such terms as psychopathy, sociopathy, criminality, or specific signs and symptoms recommended by diagnostic manuals. Now, full Monty, or the full pathology, is what Devlin and I referred to as the Kernbergian quaternity. A person of interest who qualified for the term malignant narcissist leader shall qualify for the term Kernbergian quaternity positive if he evinces, according to information and belief or other evidence, the additional items of egocentric sadism characterized by pleasure, gratification, or elation derived from the infliction of pain on objects consonant with the subject's ideals and self-concept, and a paranoid outlook characterized by unwarranted suspicion that malevolent objects intend to harm the subject via plots, exploitation, untrustworthiness, attacks, or betrayal. So to some, the full criteria is for a malignantly narcissistic leader would be narcissism, criminality, sadism, and paranoia. Etiology. Where do these guys come from? Relevant etiological childhood factors include a traumatic learning history, disorganized attachment, orphan psychology, neglect, abuse, paternal or maternal violence, paternal or maternal neglect, pernicious role modeling, or a disruption to Ericksonian stage negotiation. The malignant narcissist may uniquely solve the crisis of faith versus doubt by stepping beside the self and violently self-cathecting. So if you remember your Psychology 101 back when you had to know the Ericksonian stages of development, the very, very first stage is when of development after birth is when the infant is utterly dependent on objects outside of the self. And if there's a degree of disruption in nurturing, it will be very, very hard, according to Erickson's theory, to attach to others in good faith, to attach to or to attach to this notion that there's something out there, like a god or some sort of higher power in the universe that is developmentally foundational upon parental nurturing, that is reliable. But I think in terms of the arrangement that the embryonic malignant narcissist makes at that developmental stage, when there is this crisis in being able to cathect on reliable external objects, that there's an amount of self-division in the baby ego state. There's an area that becomes unconscious that assembles the abandonment depression, and but the ego, rather than falling into despair, somehow manages to cling to itself and to double down on being the centerpiece of all that is. And this is the genetic developmental place, the beginning of malignantly narcissistic development. Concepts of soul murder, child abuse, and abandonment depression, characterized by rage, not least, inform understanding of the malignant leader's character formation. Environmental violence and pernicious role modeling are also etiological factors informing this particular type of pathological character. Here's a non-exhaustive list of overlapping constructs that are relevant to assessing any malignant narcissist that might be on your radar screen. Investigators might reference this list of overlapping construct to hone the assessment of any person of interest who qualifies for criteria related to a malignant narcissist in leadership. The terms are grandiosity in combination with aggression, egomania, ego inflation, megalomania, loyalty to ideological supporters. Why? because that loyalty garners more narcissistic supplies to keep the false self of the amazing, the person, the great man, the answer, the Messiah. That loyalty to the supporters keeps the supporters loyal to them. Invented worldview, idealization of destructive facets of the self. In many cases, like in militaristic versions of this phenomenon, you'll see an identification with militarism, right? This is toxic masculinity. Destruction or rejection of love for superiority maintenance. Love makes people vulnerable. These actors tend not to have genuinely loving relationships because they can't be vulnerable. They refuse to be vulnerable. Inability to negotiate or compromise for superiority maintenance. Manipulative object relations. Uncanniness. There is, getting back to the conversation between the photojournalist and Major Willard in Apocalypse Now, there is something uncanny, something unfamiliar about the malignant narcissist in power. They have something that often inspires awe and fear and a sense that there is something unique about them. Just for an example, in the journal of a German intellectual who met Adolf Hitler for the first time, he wrote that the experience was so overpowering that he had to spend time mastering meeting this great Führer in silence, right? I mean, I can't think of the last time or any time that I met somebody who I had to actually, who made such an impression on me that I had to actually sit and try to comprehend this greatness that the person had, right? But this particular German intellectual did, and he wasn't the only one who found something about this malignant narcissist uncanny and desiring and needful of his personal reflection. These actors will have oratory giftedness. They will have charisma, despite the fact that they're despicable. And criminality in service to the ego is another catchphrase that those of you who are assessing and profiling individuals like this might want to keep in mind. Criminality in service to the ego, right? It's not normal sociopathy. There is this narcissistic component. So very often there is this sense that the criminal acts that they perpetrate are somehow building up their myth or qualifying them in some way. Albert Speer, just to use Hitler because he's such an epitome of this phenomenon, Albert Speer wrote that after the fall of France, Hitler disclosed to him, Speer, a man like me comes along only once in 1,000 years. Adolf Hitler's criminality was in service to his legacy, and his crime of the genocide of European Jewry was something that he wanted to keep going. He felt that would improve his legacy, and he, in his political testament, the last thing that he wrote before his suicide in Berlin, he urged that the crimes against the Jews should persist. Criminality in service to the ego. Here's vulnerability factors for individuals and groups likely to be dominated by a malignantly narcissistic leader. An individual or a group will be vulnerable to this type of actor if they have transitions of some sort. These transitions provide opportunities for malignant actors to gain control. Vulnerable individuals include idealists, reactionaries, and pilgrims, as well as the economically motivated and persons in search of a savior. Groups seeking social stability combined with a tradition, or the so-called authoritarian characters who are anxious to regress to a norm. Groups frustrated from lack of social progress. These will be the revolutionaries. A group anxious to transcend to the next level of social development, or groups otherwise imperiled may succumb to the influence of a malignant leader. Leaders with psychopathic traits and features of malignant narcissism, like ruthlessness, not only take advantage of chaotic political and social situations, they view them as opportunities. Here's a dismal aside. Listen to this. About 75 years ago, Hermann Goering, Adolf Hitler's lieutenant, testified at the Nuremberg Court of Appeal. Being asked, how did you get the German people to accept all this? Goering replied, it was very easy. It had nothing to do with Nazism. It has something to do with human nature. How you can do it in a Nazi, socialist, communist regime, in a monarchy, or even a democracy. The only thing that needs to be done to enslave people is to scare them. If you manage to find a way to scare people, you can make them do what you want. And the creation of enemies is one way to make people afraid. It's a way to unify a group around a leader. And in the exhaustive historical and psychiatric review that Devlin and I have made, we have found almost no malignant narcissist in power who doesn't in some way create enemies, or at least a principle of some kind for followers to be afraid of, and to look to the malignant leader as a kind of messiah against that threat. The ideation of malignant narcissists in leadership is an important consideration. Ideation supportive of narcissistic traits include unconscious, preconscious, or conscious cognition, such as, I am an infallible visionary with unlimited scope. I am a special case. I know everything. I alone can solve this problem. Narcissistic ideas. And you can abstract these from public statements or records of such actors. Elaborating on the leader's narcissistic defenses. An irony of the malignant character is the trait-like desire to lord as a superior person, or a great man, or a magic person, while requiring narcissistic supplies and applause from other people. There is a level of dependency that the dear leader will have upon endless applause. Thus, the destructive leader populates his immediate circle with people who, regardless of their merits, are sycophants and administer pharmaceutical grade blandishments and exculpations like insulin to a self-esteemed diabetic. When the destructive leader's ideal image is contradicted, his narcissistic imagery or his narcissistic injury is bad for everybody. When failure interrupts the mad chief's exalted self-image, narcissistic rage will overwhelm his intellect and behavior. For instance, when the US-led forces drove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, the dictator's dreams of glory collapsed, and he retaliated by burning the nation's oil fields in an act of eco-terrorism, leading a CIA profiler to muse, if he could not have Kuwait's oil, then neither could the United States. He was compelled to take action to restore his sense of efficacy and power, defending against passive powerlessness with redemptive and powerful action. Saddam's defeat in the first Gulf War was such that he had a narcissistic insult. It was a defeat, and to compensate for that insult, he engaged in this destructive act to restore his sense of efficacy and invulnerability. Here's some ideation supportive of the criminal traits of this actor. The ends justify the means. Might makes right. History demands this. Nothing I do can be wrong. Getting what I want is right because it's me. Right? That's that last one. That's about being a law unto oneself. These actors are simply that way. They see themselves as above the law, better than the law, more important than the law, and people who should not be held to account because of their near metaphysical uniqueness. Statements justifying illegalities in service to a greater good emerge from the malignant leader's criminal cognitive structure. They say to themselves, we must break the law to preserve it. It is as if his conscience issues pardons to his ego. And the ego wears the mantle of the ego ideal or the ideal self while issuing indictments even unto reasonable and innocent opposition. They hate to be held to account. That's part of their narcissism, but most especially their criminal traits. Avarice, concupiscence, and envy may comprise the criminal impulse. Remember that Cain's fratricide was motivated by envy. The destructive leader will transform his crimes into expressions of virtue. Criminal organizations reflective of criminal leadership include Soviet Russia, the Rajneesh cult, and Enron. Interestingly, the successful criminality of the corporate sociopath may be attributed to a larger prefrontal cortex than those enjoyed by less neurologically endowed criminals. That's an important piece to keep in mind. The successful leaders of this variety really are gifted. I mean, it's easy to cartoon them, and it's easy to think that, oh, well, you know, if I was in their orbit, I wouldn't be brought under their sway. But they have many gifts, and among those gifts is a high degree of intelligence. And their narcissistic confidence also renders them charismatic. And they have a gift for oratory as well. Well-spoken, smart, lots of cold empathy and ability to manipulate people. They're formidable. We need to be constantly on our guard. Among the things that Devlin and I discovered was the ubiquity of this phenomenon. These actors don't always rise to the national or international level. They're in charge of families, the homeowners association, small businesses, parish churches. Here's some ideation supportive of egosyntonic sadistic traits. Out of these traits, such ideation like this might emerge. This is justice, hurting a perceived enemy. They deserve this. Diseases must be eradicated. Diseases referring to dehumanizing an out group or an out person, dehumanizing them by calling them diseases or simply demonizing them. It's okay if you kill them because they're really bad, right? Better them than me. Injuring them makes me feel all-powerful, and I love it, right? Thriving on inflicting pain. Godlike power, getting back to the God drive. Sadism converts the mad leader's impotence into omniscience. Wars of aggression and unfriendly takeovers express sadism's inter-alchemy, as does schoolyard bullying. All of it is transforming the core sense that's in the abandonment, depression, impotence, powerlessness, helplessness into omnipotence. Further expression of the God drive. For such individuals, sadism is genuinely transportive, even therapeutic. It may feed the narcissistic drive to have no limits and ratify grandiose notions of omnipotence. One physiological explanation is that traumatic learning may have compromised the malignant leader's neurochemistry, resulting in lower arousal, blue mood, and anhedonia or joylessness. But a quick visit to the torture chamber or shooting the children of an opponent in front of their mothers may be a boost to the mood that puts spring in the boss's step. Such sadism can result in euphoria, along with vengeful satisfaction and a welcome sense of godlike power conferred by homicide and acted out hatred, leading the boss to sing, "I am Superman and I know what's happening." Here are some examples of ideation supportive of paranoid traits. That group intends to harm us. No one can be trusted. They plot against us. Agents are everywhere. They threaten to discover weakness I deny to myself. Paranoia is especially present in malignant leaders with apocalyptic worldviews. For example, millenarian religious leaders, political future, golden age, devastating stock market collapses. These are all the kinds of things that get wrapped up in the paranoia. Let's talk about one famous example from the last century. And this is Joseph Stalin. One commentator on the paranoia writes, given that Stalin was a first-class tyrant, mass murderer, and torturer of his people, and that he made some huge mistakes, his fears were not altogether unjustified. He was also insecure about his height, his pockmarked face, his withered hand, his questionable past, and birth defects, so he was on edge regarding a number of things. The net result of his situation made him paranoid about many little, small, medium, and big things. Stalin arrested, shot, imprisoned, and tortured millions of people, many of them innocent, and many guilty of arousing Stalin's hatred or suspicion by associating with other groups or people. When in doubt, Stalin exiled, arrested, killed, tortured for confession, imprisoned, or fired people. They say it did not help to look at him the wrong way. The incredible thing in all this was that Stalin trusted Hitler. Anyway, Stalin had in his career as the premier of the Soviet Union a remarkable paranoid tenure marked by sadistic behavior towards any group or individual he suspected presented a threat. Very often the threat was utterly imagined. Nonetheless, he wrecked countless lives. Read the Gulag Archipelago or any such book. This is an excerpt from the Psychodynastic Manual, and it could be applied directly to Joseph Stalin. Because pathologically paranoid individuals tend to have histories marked by felt shame and humiliation, they expect to be humiliated by others and may attack first in order to spare themselves the agony of waiting for the inevitable attack from outside. Their expectation of mistreatment creates the suspiciousness and hypervigilance for which they are noted, attitudes that tend to evoke the hostile and humiliating responses they fear. Their personality is defensively organized around the themes of danger and power, either the persecutory power of others or the megalomaniac power of the self. The paranoid element of the malignant leader's character involves projecting threatening elements of his own mind onto external others. From these projectively identified targets, the leader senses danger and takes emergency measures to destroy the threats. The destructive leader will defend against their pathological sense of danger with preemptive strikes, even against non-aggressors. Now, you're going to see this especially happens when the leader is under stress. They start to consume their inner circles, and you have this thing of, purges, excommunications, firings, and so forth. Let me say a word about the thanatological features or the death-related features of the malignant narcissist in leadership. A person with malignant traits is at heightened risk for homicide or suicide. A mortality risk exists not only for the malignant leader's enemies, but also the leader's friends and followers. If you, going back to Hitler, for example, when he purged the SA, many of the officers who supported him were so loyal to him, even when they were being shot. They gave the salute, Heil Hitler, they said, before the report of the weapon rang out and they fell to the ground dead. He was purging loyalists. Any entity or group within the malignant leader's purview may fall victim to his death drive. Thanatological considerations regarding the malignant leader's lethality include, but are not limited to, the following. And I've already gone through that. Anyone in his orbit, and even those outside of his orbit. depending on how high the level of leadership is and what resources are at the leader's disposal. Ideological dehumanization or demonization of others may precede murder, persecution, or genocide, because individuals with malignant narcissism consistently attempt to destroy, symbolically castrate, and dehumanize others. Their sadism is often expressed in ideological terms or theological terms. You know, you think of, you know, how many religions have this malignantly narcissistic component to them. You know, if you don't believe exactly the way we believe, you will go to hell. If you don't have this, if you don't agree with our platform, you're part of the out group and have forfeited your humanity. So we can symbolically say that you're going to hell, that you're not worthy of paradise, you're not human. It's okay if we think of you as not human. And this is a frequent problem in these groups, whatever their nature. Those that aren't in the in-group and loyal to the leader are robbed of humanity once the group no longer sees the out-group as human. They have a clear conscience regarding following the leader's urging to persecute or to aggress against the rights of the out person or the out group in some way. Because individuals with malignant narcissism demonstrate egocentric sadism, I'm blocked from being able to read my whole slide here. But anyway, the gist of this is the malignant leader is potentially lethal. And if they are held to account, they may decide that rather than submit to some type of accountability, like at a military tribunal or being hauled into court by the authorities, they may choose some type of heroic suicide in order to escape accountability if they can't flee and start up somewhere else. And they'll depict this suicide as a way, as something heroic, a way to transcend the desecration of their greatness by a group that has failed to understand that greatness. And you can see this, Kernberg points it out in his writing, that certainly Hitler's suicide was of this ilk. And he brought others with him. You know, many in the SS committed suicide when they found that Adolf Hitler committed suicide. If you think of Jim Jones, rather than risk being held to account potentially by federal authorities, he concocted this notion of preserving his integrity as a messianic figure with a revolutionary suicide, and inflicted this revolutionary suicide on his followers in Jonestown. So this is something that you who are clinicians especially need to keep in mind if you're conducting psychotherapy with someone who is still in the orbit of a malignant leader. Keep this notion in mind that there is a degree of lethality involved in being in the orbit of these actors, and you need to check in with that, with your patient. Is the leader under stress? How's he doing with this apocalyptic vision? Has an indictment come down? Stay on top of that so that you can protect your patient from potential death. I'm going to move on. I'm going to turn the floor over to Peter Devlin, who has conducted a historical search on this phenomenon to demonstrate that it is cross-cultural and trans-historical as a phenomenon.
So in my portion of the lecture, I'm going to be adding some flesh to the theoretical edifice for malignant narcissist leaders that Dr. Zeiders has just so cogently given. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss 3 historical case studies of malignant narcissist leaders that I hope will speak to why this is an important description of this type of leadership. I'm going to begin by framing them within the context of tyrannical leadership. As many of you know, the first character in world literature is Gilgamesh. It's the earliest recorded story about a human being and who happens to be a tyrant. And Gilgamesh was a Sumerian king. He was the priest king of Uruk. And of course, as I said earlier, the first epic hero in world literature. It's important, just as sort of a side note, that he was so tyrannical that the people of Uruk cried out to the gods for help so that they could find peace in their city-state. And the gods heard them and instructed Anu, who I think was the goddess of creation in the Sumerian pantheon, to make a twin for Gilgamesh, who, of course, many of you know is Enkidu, this wild man. And in some way, I think that our lecture today is a very tiny, maybe feeble attempt to address malignant narcissist leaders and illuminate what a problem this is, what a problem a Gilgamesh can be. Tyrants, of course, are as diverse as we are, as humanity. For example, starting on the left, you have Elaine Ceausescu, who is Lady Macbeth of Romania. And the next person is Phalaris, who is a Greek tyrant in what is now Agrigento in Sicily. That if you look, there's a bull here that's actually a bronze bull that he invented for roasting torture victims. And so that's his claim to fame, one of his claims to fame anyways. And then toward the end, you have Ivan the Terrible and Kim Il-sung, who are sort of, at the very least, infamous fathers, if not also well-known tyrants. Whoops. So I'm going to discuss, just to frame this, tyranny itself. And in part, I borrow this from Walter Newell in his book, Tyrants, which A History of Power, Injustice, and Terror. And in the book, Newell says there are 3 types of tyranny. The garden variety. Garden variety tyrants seek power for personal gain. They are transactional. They exploit a nation or human beings for money, sexual pleasure, and shiny objects. The next are the reformers. The reformers, on the other hand, seek power to change their nation or society. They engage in large building projects, improve schools, and rarely use violence wantonly. Camille Adaric might be a prototypical reform tyrant. And then you have the millenarian tyrant. Newell believes that they are a modern phenomenon. As you'll see further, disagree slightly with this, but Newell believes they are a modern phenomenon. For Newell, the ascendancy of the millenarian tyrant begins with the French Revolution. Of course, garden variety and reformer tyrants existed before the revolution and continue to resurface. So, but with Robespierre and the Jacobins, a new form of tyranny, according to Newell, appeared. Newell describes this new form of tyranny as characterized by the willingness of a leader to commit mass murder in the service of a utopian vision. It is, and I'm quoting him here now, it is driven by a utopian aim in which society is to be transformed from being unjust, materialistic, and selfish in the present to being spiritually pure, selfless, and communal in the future. And of course, we all know what happened to Robespierre. Not a happy ending, to say the least. So this new tyranny is characterized by, as I said, a willingness of a leader to commit mass murder in the service of a utopian vision. These leaders also espouse an egalitarian reorganization of society, have no regard for individual liberty, and typically foster an outside enemy. So this sort of description by Newell is also mirrored by another historian, Daniel Chiraud, in his book, Modern Tyrants. And he writes that modern dictators like Mao, Hitler, and Stalin were worshipped. And I'm quoting from here now. I'm quoting from him now, in ways no mortal has been since the great religious prophets of the past. And he includes in that Jesus Christ, Buddha, and Muhammad. These leaders, he also writes, these leaders believed that they had a profound understanding of the human condition and that only they could free humanity from human suffering and the vicissitudes of existence. They believed they could radically upend social norms and societies and remake them. I like this quote from Eric Hoffer from his book, The True Believer. He wrote about sort of millenarian leaders, that they have a fanatical conviction that he or she is in possession of the one and only truth, faith in his or her destiny and luck, a capacity for passionate hatred, contempt for the present, a cunning estimate of human nature, a delight in symbols, spectacles, and ceremonies, unbounded brazenness, which finds expression in a disregard of consistency and fairness, and a recognition that the innermost craving is for communion and that there can never be too much of it. So in his book, Newell writes that this new form of tyranny deserves to be classified. And as Dr. Zeiders noted earlier, that Erich Fromm was one of the prime movers in describing this type of person. In his book, Heart of Man, Its Genius for Good and Evil, the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm first described and coined the term malignant narcissism. He wrote that such individuals are self-centered, grandiose, sadistic, suspicious, and disregard the rights of others. They also lack empathy and seek power through exploitation and abuse. And just a quick review. I know Dr. Zeiders provided such depth in his lecture, but although malignant narcissism is not a discrete category in the DSM-5, it's a shorthand description for individuals who share the comorbidities of narcissism and antisocial personality disorders. That is, an individual who is both pathologically narcissistic and antisocial, where self-justifiable violence, sadistic cruelty, and self-destructiveness are in service to a very fragile and unstable self-esteem. They are often unaware that their grandiosity is a mask for self-loathing, self-doubt, and fear. Their extreme narcissism is like air blown into a balloon. It inflates a shriveled self. I love this painting by Caravaggio, who I guess was the Lord Byron of the Italian Baroque, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. In this painting, Narcissus is bathed in darkness. Landscape is non-existent. It's as if he is in his own personal psychic hell. This painting contrasts with other images we have of Narcissus from both literature and painting, where Narcissus, with supermodel good looks, stares adoringly at his image in a bucolic setting. I want you to hold onto this image as we go forward. It's almost too easy to ignore, as Dr. Zeiders said. It's almost too easy to ignore the humanity of a malignant narcissist leader and portray them with a sobriquet evil. Easy because their pathology is so destructive. Nevertheless, the leaders portrayed throughout our lecture are deeply human, even though their humanity is bent. A better word for their pathology would be agony. Although they inflict suffering on others, they too suffer deeply. Disavowing their humanity and portraying them as demons only inflates the malignant narcissist leader beyond the realm of the merely human. If they are seen as they truly are, dependent, stunted, pompous, and cruel, then the nimbus of sacredness around them attributed by their followers disappears. That's why that image of Narcissus is so poignant, because I think it captures the malignant narcissist leader better than portraying a malignant narcissist as satanic or evil or in some other way. So I'd like to begin through my cross-cultural and historical case studies. I'm going to discuss 3 malignant narcissist leaders: Jan of Leiden, Hong Zhuan, and Credonia Merende. Maybe a few of you are familiar with these leaders, but I found through other lectures most people are unfamiliar with these leaders. And I'm just going to begin in chronological order with Jan of Leiden. So Jan of Leiden was born in 1506. He was born into poverty out of wedlock. He had artistic aspirations, and many of the leaders we've discussed had artistic aspirations, interestingly enough. His were as an actor and dramatist. He was also, of course, a gifted orator, as Dr. Zeiders mentioned before. Many of these leaders are gifted, orators, and charismatic. And before he arrived in Munster, and in a few moments I'm going to describe the siege of Munster, he had he drifted between trades, although he is best known as a tailor. So he's sometimes known as Jan the Tailor. But at some point during this peripatetic existence, he became part of the Anabaptist movement. I'm going to argue that and disagree with Newell that Jan of Leiden is actually a precursor to the millenarian leader, if not, in fact, a millenarian leader himself. And that Jan of Leiden's leadership began Newell's new category of leadership. He was a new kind of leader, one with authority rooted in the transcendental, and who ruled through totalistic de-individuation and terror. Just a quick discussion on the Anabaptist movement. The Anabaptists, of which Jan was a member, was part of the great Christian schism of the 16th century. They believe that the conversion and baptism to Christian beliefs must be undertaken in adulthood when an individual was old enough to decide on these matters. They were literalists who believed in the primacy of the New Testament over ecclesiastical tradition and allegiance to the state. They believed all types of work, whether peasant, artisan, or merchant, served God. Therefore, they believe class distinction should be eradicated. They were filled with an apocalyptic fervor because their New Jerusalem, which is what they called the transformation to the New World, would be an egalitarian and spiritual utopia, and they believed that was imminent. The movement began in the wake of the German Peasants' War of the 1520s, which many scholars believe jaded the Anabaptists against any demand to higher earthly authority. These beliefs, by the way, incited Luther to urge genocide against the Anabaptists. Maybe to dispel your images of the 16th century, it wasn't just the century of Christian schisms and bloody peasants' revolts, but also a period of religious experimentation and ideas within Christianity. So if you have an idea that sort of the Protestant Reformation, it's a famous portrait by, I think it was Lucas Cranach the Elder, of a somber Luther, you should know that the early 16th century was also, I don't want to call it a summer of love within Christianity, because it certainly wasn't that, but there was all kinds of experimentation taking place. For example, there was a sect that was an offshoot of the Taborite movement that declared the chaste were unworthy to enter their messianic kingdom. They practiced free love and chose to be naked in order to be in a state of innocence. And this is another sort of neo-Adamite cult, or a sect rather, not cult, being arrested in Amsterdam at about the same time. So this is the town of Munster, where Jan would reign. This, I believe, is right before he began his reign. Munster was an independent German principality in the province of Westphalia, and it's just north of Cologne. At the time, Jan, Jan was leader of the town of Munster, or rather the Anabaptist movement within the walls of that town. The Anabaptists were under siege and had expelled the bishop, all Catholics and all Lutherans. They at first established their leadership under Jan Matthias and then Jan of Leyden. So you can see the town here in 1535, surrounded by the mercenaries loyal to Franz von Waldock, who was the ousted bishop of Munster, and of course, who wanted the city returned to him. Before his ascension to this throne, his predecessor was a Dutch baker and Anabaptist Savonarola named John Matthias. Jan of Leyden was one of Matthias's aide-de-camps. Under Matthias, the Anabaptists burned books and paintings, including the paintings of an entire school of painters, the Westphalians. And of course, they were thrown into bonfires where they were extinguished forever. On Easter Sunday of 1535, Matthias charged on horseback against Bishop von Waldock's mercenary army in the belief that God would protect him and reward him in battle. He and 12 disciples who rode with him were slaughtered and then dismembered. Jan's head was impaled on a pike, and unfortunately, his genitals were nailed to one of Munster's gates. Therefore, there was a power vacuum, and Jan of Leyden quickly declared himself a leader before a crowd of people outside St. Paul's Cathedral in Munster, with, as described, a magnificent oration, which some pamphleteers at the time compared to Mark Antony's famous speech in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. As a leader, Jan dismissed the city council and appointed 12 elders after the 12 tribes of Israel to sanction his new laws. In a city besieged and on the brink of famine, Jan rode a white horse through the narrow cobbled streets to his throne in a procession of courtiers and wives. The Munster craftsmen smelt Jan a gold crown, gold medallions, and a gold scepter, and a gold sword sheath and belt, and built him a throne. He declared Munster the New Jerusalem, the spiritual capital of the Anabaptist movement, and prophesied that his movement would soon overtake not just Europe, but the world. He decreed the death penalty, not only for murder and sedition, but for blasphemy, spreading scandal, adultery, avarice, fraud, lying, criticizing one's parents, or even complaining. So just about everything. Terror was used in Munster and by Jan as a method of subjugation, according to Norman Cohn in his canonical book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, Revolutionary Millenarians and Mystical Anarchists of the Middle Ages. Women were the first Munster citizens to be executed for crimes against the New Jerusalem. Jan, of course, Jan's name for the spiritual capital of his Christian utopia or dystopia. These crimes, Jan also shrewdly chose bodyguards from men who had drifted into Munster at about the time of his ascendancy and who had little or no relationship with Munster citizens. These bodyguards were free to execute anyone they wished. Every citizen of Munster was a potential victim of this regime. The Terror might be seen as a forerunner of Stalin's more contemporary Great Terror or Mao's Red Terror. Jan of Leiden, I would argue, is the historical avatar of for the modern totalitarian state and the totalistic cult. His rule parallels the later subjugation methods of both cult and totalitarian leaders. For example, he sought a radical reorganization of Munster and society. The Anabaptists had always held strict puritanical beliefs on sex. Infidelity was a capital offense in Munster before Jan came to power. However, once Jan became leader of Munster, he declared that every citizen must be married and decreed polygamy, not just legal, but a law. Every citizen must obey. Unlike the Neo-Adamite sects mentioned before, the polygamy in Munster was governed by Jan, and it reveals Jan's totalistic control of Munster's citizens, even their deepest intimacies. Jan had one of his acolytes decree, as I mentioned, he had one of his acolytes decree polygamy a law that everyone in Munster must accept. When a blacksmith named Heinrich Mullenbeck led a revolt against this decree, Jan had the rebels tortured and beheaded. Jan himself married 16 young women, including the former wife of Jan, Matthias, the purportedly beautiful Devara, whom Jan had anointed his queen. Then there was Jan's dramatic performances of his transcendental powers and use of oratory as a political tool. Cohn and others write that Jan was extraordinarily attractive, I guess at least to people in the 16th century, and he was remarkably eloquent. He created outdoor showpieces and parades that demonstrated his transcendent power. As a reminder or a reference point, other malignant narcissist tyrants have also used gatherings, rallies, and parades as a visual means to display and assert their power. Jan's gifts for dramatic spectacle are evocative of Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda films or Mussolini upon a horse raising his arm in the Roman salute. One difference, as a king from other sort of malignant narcissist leaders, Jan also held the office of public executioner and personally executed those whom he deemed to have transgressed God's laws. Most of the other malignant narcissist leaders throughout history are usually removed from the execution of their victims. Jan's reign of terror ended when two dissidents, fearful of their fate in Jan's bloody and famine-stricken by then New Jerusalem, slipped away and fled to the bishop's mercenaries. They informed the bishop and his generals of weaknesses in Munster's walls. The mercenaries stormed one of the weak spots and eventually Munster itself. Queen Devara was beheaded and Jan was attached to a pole by an iron spike collar. His body was ripped with red hot tongs for the space of an hour, and he died after his heart was pierced with a red hot dagger. And so a bloody ending, to say the least. That cage, which still hangs from St. Labert, he was after he died, he was placed in a cage, and that cage hung from St. Lambert's Cathedral, or St. Lambert's Church in Munster, and that cage still hangs there today. So if you ever want to take a Malignant Narcissist leader tour of the world, you can stop in Munster and see the cage that still exists, where Jan of Leiden's body decomposed. I would argue that Munster's fall, as well as Jan's, parallels the fate of other tragic and disastrous millenarian movements. There have been sieges with other malignant narcissist leaders that resemble Munster's extraordinary moment in European history. And there have been malignant narcissist leaders who unmistakably resemble Jan. Much has been written about these movements and their leaders, but less has been written about the similarities these leaders share in their followers' intense devotion to them. And this is where Dr. Zeiders and I want to fill in that story and provide sort of psychological analysis of what actually has been taking place. Here's St. Lambert's Church today, and you can see the cages where Jan hung, where Jan's body was hung, and also two of his followers. My next case study is Hong Zhuan. If Hong Zhuan never existed, China, and the world for that matter, would be dramatically different. Hong Zhuan was leader of the Taiping Rebellion, which was the deadliest rebellion in world history. So I'm just going to repeat that. It was the deadliest rebellion in human history. More people died in that rebellion than any other. He did so claiming to be the brother of Jesus Christ. Hong's life in some ways parallels Jan's. Before his rise to power, Hong was a village school teacher in China. After he failed his final attempt at the imperial exams, which had only a 1% passing rate, he fell into a deep catatonic depression. When he emerged from this, he proclaimed that he was the brother of Jesus Christ and began preaching a theology that, according to some historians, pursued a land reform program that represented the most radically egalitarian in recorded history. But I should note, while he simultaneously and contradictorily declared himself the Emperor of Taiping, his newly founded spiritual nation. Like Jan of Leiden, Hong attempted to establish a theocracy with strict laws that were antipodal to the existing social order. In Hong's Zhuan's heavenly kingdom, men and women, even married couples, lived separately, and sex of any kind was prohibited. Of course, this prohibition did not apply to Hong, who had a harem of concubines living with him in his palace. And the Taiping Rebellion was 1850 to 1864, sort of in part of that during our own civil war in this country. But Hong's millenarian vision of the heavenly kingdom posed a major threat to the Qing dynasty. It led to a Qing dynasty army besieging and destroying Taiping in 1864. Here, you can see the extent, by the way, of the Taiping Kingdom under Hong. So a significant portion of China at the time was under Hong's control. Of course, like Jan's time in Munster, it ended Hong's reign, and it ended in a bloody fashion. In the spring of 1864, Taiping was besieged and dangerously low on food. Months into the siege, as in Munster, people were starving. Hong ordered people to eat weeds, and Hong himself gathered these weeds from the grounds of the palace, which he ate. He fell ill in April 1864, possibly from eating these weeds. And also, it's likely that he died of his illness, but some historians believe he committed suicide. He was buried before Taiping fell, and placed in a soaked shroud without a coffin near his palace, and he was succeeded by his teenage son. But of course, Taiping fell, his son was murdered, and the Qing forces exhumed, beheaded, and burned his body. And his ashes were later blasted out of a cannon by the Qing army in order to ensure that his remains would have no resting place, as an eternal punishment for this uprising. Views on Hong differ greatly. The communists under Mao greatly admired Hong and his movement as a legitimate peasant uprising that anticipated their own. Yes, Sun Yat-sen came from the same area as Hong, was said to have identified with Hong. But it's important to remember that during this rebellion, more than 30 million people died during the rebellion. More than 30 million people were killed, which was the population of the United States at that time, which is why it's considered the bloodiest rebellion in human history. By the way, if you are, again, taking a tour of malignant narcissist leaders worldwide, there is a museum dedicated to Hong in China. It's his former, it's called the Hongzhuan Former Residence Memorial Museum in his birthplace, and you can see a replica of his throne. And I guess there's other also mementos from Hong's reign as well. And here's a sort of contemporary portrait by the current regime of Hong. So he looks like a superhero. The next person I'm going to talk about, and final person, is Cordonia Mruende. She's the one malignant narcissist leader who may still be alive. So who knows? Maybe she's in our audience. So the largest mass suicide or murder by religious movement occurred in 2000 and was perpetrated by a little-known Ugandan religious movement. It was called the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments, and it was founded by Credonia Merende, who is the leader of the movement. Oops. So Credonia, like Jan, like Hong, also drifted through life, had many occupations. She was the owner of a bar, a brewer of banana beer. Ugandan authorities suspect that she poisoned her three brothers in order to inherit their property before she had this religious epiphany. This epiphany occurred in a cave near her home in Uganda. She envisioned that she directly spoke to the Virgin Mary, who told her to spread the word of God. Standing at the entrance of the cave was a large megalith-like stone that Merende claimed portrayed the Virgin Mary turning her back to a fallen world. While in the cave, she reported Marian visions as well as visions of Jesus Christ. And this is actually a photograph of the cave and the megalith-like structure that Merende claims is Mary turning her back on a fallen world. Merende's millenarian movement, which was also a sect of the Roman Catholic Church, like the other movements we've discussed, was imbued with a mystical culture, transcendental culture. Many of the people, by the way, had extravagant titles. What is striking about Merende is not so much her personal charisma, although she is described as flamboyant, but like Hong and like Jan, her domination of those who followed her. Her name, one of her names was the programmer. That amongst the leaders, they called her the programmer because she designed an indoctrination program for followers that not only that isolated them from their families and societies, but was totalistic. So followers sold all their possessions, cut off familial ties. Again, she forbade sex between spouses, permitted followers one meal each day, and at times even forbade speech. She, like Jan, also promised her followers a new world, a spectacular moment and ascendancy that would make the movement famous. Merende and the upper echelon of the movement had the group prepare with a week-long feast for this millenarian moment, which was to occur December 31st, 1999. When the end of the known world, when that day proved to be another ordinary day, members began to openly question Merende's authority. Merende responded with this affront to her authority by fomenting the murder and suicide of her followers. By March 2000, over 1,000 followers had died by poison or immolation, which means burning. She set fire to many of the meeting houses, and there's actually Ugandan authorities actually don't have they're uncertain about the total number of people who were killed by Miranda during this period. So what Jan of Leiden, Hong Zhuan, and Credonia Miranda have in common as a malignant narcissist leaders? And of course, Dr. Zeiders has already offered a lot of a lot of descriptions on this matter. So I'm just going to review some of the things he said. So the malignant narcissist leader, before ascending to power, leads a peripatetic existence, often marked by some type of failure. Malignant narcissist leaders attracted to religious movements, or I would say transcendental movements. So it can be, there's a certain millenarian element to some of the political ideological movements that we've been talking about. The malignant narcissist leader often appears within millenarian or transcendental movements. Once they establish themselves as leaders of the movement, they inspire followers to surrender themselves to the leader's millenarian plans. This begins a profoundly deep and disturbing relationship between leader and follower. Millenarian leaders are charismatic. This means they are special, at least to their followers, and they exist separate from the mundane and ordinary human beings. The malignant narcissist leader embodies the transcendental and appears to his or her followers as chosen by God or history to achieve a millenarian plan. They become God or God's authority on earth. It is this spiritual authority that cements the millenarian leader's authority over their followers. It also feeds the malignant narcissist leaders' need for adulation. It too allows them to place the mask of God over their self-doubt and psychic chaos. Once in power, malignant narcissist leaders are totalistic, paranoid, and sadistic. Unlike other types of tyrants, the millenarian tyrant embodies a transcendent belief system. As avatars, their pathology becomes unfettered. Their cruelty becomes capricious. They use millenarian, ideological, and spiritual beliefs to justify the dehumanization of their followers. They then play with them like murderous children. Followers are psychically eaten by the malignant narcissist leader. Followers surrender and lose their identities and become players in the leader's psychic enactment of a personal pathology. The malignant narcissist leader directs paranoia and hatred toward a single enemy. For Stalin, it was the Trotskyites. For Mao, it was the bourgeois. For Pol Pot, it was Cambodian ethnic and religious groups. For Jan of Leiden, it was the Jews, the clergy, and the rich. For Oceania, the superstate depicted in 1984, Orwell's 1984, of course, it was Emmanuel Goldstein. This enemy, whose malevolence and threat to the state is often imaginary, unites followers in a sacred war. The creation of an enemy is also a violent manifestation of the leader's own paranoia and fear. There are often sound reasons for a dictatorial leader to be paranoid. I remember Seneca told Nero, you can never kill your successor. However, Malignant narcissist leaders combine these fears with a psychological fear or anxiety that their grandiosity covers up a mundane and self-loathing wretch. For example, Stalin had a sadistically whimsical temperament. In his canonical book on the 1930 purges, The Great Terror, Robert Conquest writes that the reasons Stalin decided to execute a reprieve were often senseless and vindictive. In 1927, Dr. Vladimir Mikhailovich Bekhterev, I hope I pronounced that right, a highly esteemed neuroscientist of international renown, examined Stalin. Although the reason for the examination is uncertain, Dr. Bekhterev mentioned to colleagues later in the evening that he had just examined a paranoiac, never mentioning Stalin's name. The following day, Bekhterev suddenly and mysteriously died. Stalin then ordered that Bekhtere's name and corpus be removed from Soviet schools and publications. And yet, a university student who is going to be jailed for throwing a dart at a portrait of Stalin sent an appeal to Stalin. Stalin responded by not only exonerating the student, but praising him for his marksmanship. The destructiveness of the malignant narcissist leader. When a malignant leader's failed promises lead to disaffection by their followers, murderous violence can ensue, as we've seen with all three case studies. The malignant leader, on the other hand, must maintain the illusion of their omnipotence for reasons that are deeply rooted in their personal pathology. According to Daniel Shaw, their dependency on their followers is deeply ambivalent and conflicted. They both need adulation to fuel their stunted egos, and whether aware or not, abhor this dependency. The leader then acts with sometimes extraordinary cruelty to his or her dependents. So as Dr. Zeiders again already previously stated so brilliantly, why is this a problem for you and me? Malignant narcissist leaders prey upon every race, class, and religion. Their followers can be anyone. Scientists made sarin gas for Shoko Asahara. Catholic priests were leaders in Credonia Merendes, the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. TV actresses recruited sex slaves for Keith Raniere. Psychoanalyst and former cult member Daniel Shaw stated in a recent podcast on indoctrination that he believes that cult leaders are increasingly forming smaller cults. However, this does not mean a diminution in the growth of cults. Instead, we may be living in a golden age for cults. The malignant narcissist leader may well be in historical ascendancy. And just some reasons: social chaos, fragmentation, and dislocation are the social conditions that the millenarian leader needs in order to thrive. When human communities and bonds sever, as they now have for most of global humanity, millenarian leaders may fill the vacuum. They offer a totalistic, communitarian, transcendental vision and ideology that attracts followers who face, as Zygmunt Bauman has written, the uncanny frailty of human bonds, the feeling of insecurity that frailty inspires, and the conflicting desires that feeling prompts to tighten the bonds. So here we return to St. Lambert Cathedral in Munster. 3 cages hang from St. Lambert's. One of the cages held Jan of Leiden's corpse after he was executed. It has hung there since his death. That empty cage may be a more appropriate memorial to malignant narcissist leaders than Lenin's tomb or Franco's Valley of the Fallen. For in the end, these leaders, as powerful as they may become, and as charming or as charismatic as they might seem to be, are deeply disturbed and capable of ugly, destructive outcomes for those around them. So I'll finish with this. It's from a Zen Buddhist. If you meet the Buddha on the road, you kill him, meaning be wary of leaders who promise you heaven on earth.